before my day, he was the guy that everyone identified with number 20.
He wasn't the biggest back, but he could run like he was. His legs never stopped moving, and although he could outrun you, he could also stiff arm you and was always ready for the contact in the name of positive yardage. And he was an acrobat on the goal line. But the overall running style of Billy Sims was smooth. His cuts looked effortless, and he darted through holes that didn't even look like they were there. And if he got in the open field, it was game over. He was one of the most dominant running backs in NCAA history, and many believe he should have been a back-to-back Heisman winner. Then he joined a bad Detroit Lions offense, who he carried for his first few years in the league, as the first great Lions running back to wear number 20. He showed he was one of the NFL's most talented backs by his first career game, and over the next 4.5 seasons would rush for over 5,000 yards, and would almost lead the Lions over the 49ers in the '83 playoffs. But less than 10 months later, he would suffer one of the most gruesome knee injuries of any player, which would end his career at the age of 29. It's hard to say how good the Lions would have been throughout the 80s if they could have continued to rely on Sims. But one thing you can say with almost certainty is that Sims would have retired as one of the best and been a lock for the Hall of Fame. But he still has an argument for the Hall even in his brief career, yet somehow is one of the least talked about halfbacks in history. Let's jog your memory. A St. Louis native, Billy Sims moved to Hooks, Texas shortly before high school, as he would spend his high school years playing running back for the Hooks Hornets. By the end of his time there, he had rushed for a total of 7,733 yards and would be a 2-time All-State selection. And as a senior, he would be an All-South and Prep All-American, while earning the Amarillo Chamber of Commerce Award as the state's most outstanding player. Throughout his time in high school, he would have 38 straight games with at least 100 rush yards, with his best game coming as a sophomore during a 45-35 playoff victory versus Rockwell, when Sims rushed for 381 yards and 5 touchdowns, with one of those coming on a punt return. Sims was the top-ranked tailback in the class of '75, but was planning on staying in Texas, as he had committed to Baylor. But Oklahoma Sooners head coach Barry Switzer had seen the tape of his Rockwell game and knew that he had to have Sims, and he would eventually convince Sims to come take a visit to Oklahoma, where Sims would be pleasantly surprised by how many Texas players the Sooners had on their roster. But the moment that Sims decided to flip his commitment came on October 17, 1974, when during halftime of a Sooners game, Switzer would call Sims at his job, which Sims couldn't believe, and by his 1975 freshman season, he was an Oklahoma Sooner. Sims had high hopes that he could excel in Switzer's wishbone offense, but it wouldn't be in 1975, as Sims was buried on the depth chart behind talent like Joe Washington, Horace Ivory, and Elvis Peacock. So as a true freshman, he would only get a total of 15 carries. But part of the reason why he had such a small role is because the Sooners were one of the nation's top teams and didn't need Sims at this time. Their high-powered rushing attack, which included quarterback Steve Davis, along with a great defense, would lead them to an 8-0 start to the year before a shocking home loss to Kansas. They would win their next 2 games to finish at 10-1 and were ranked number 3 before defeating number 5 Michigan in the Orange Bowl. And after Ohio State and Texas A&M, who were ranked number 1 and 2, lost in their bowl games, Oklahoma would get the top spot in the final polls, meaning they were national champions. As although he barely played, Sims was a champion and had finished the year rushing for 95 yards and no touchdowns. Washington had graduated, so it seemed that Sims was primed for a larger role as a sophomore in 1976. But that wouldn't be at all what would happen, as in Sims' first appearance of the season, he had carried the ball 3 times and was averaging nearly 15 yards per carry. But then he would injure his shoulder, which would end his year. And due to it being so early in the season, Oklahoma would make him a medical redshirt, as the Sooners would go 9-2-1, including a Fiesta Bowl victory over Wyoming, with Sims' season seeing him rush 3 times for 44 yards. But Sims was reportedly quite discouraged. After barely seeing the field as a freshman, and now with his injury, he felt he was falling out of favor with the coaches, so he would make the decision to quit the team and return to his job pumping gas in Hooks. But once again, Switzer would convince Sims that Oklahoma was the place for him, and Sims would say later that he didn't even remember what Switzer said, but he instilled confidence in Sims, that he would again be the player he knew he was. Sims had a larger role in 1977, but would still struggle with injuries. He would have a much better season than his 2 years prior, as he would carry the ball 65 times and find the end zone for the first time. But in their 3rd game of the year versus Ohio State, he would hurt his Achilles, which would again shorten his season. However, he would return near the end of the year as the Sooners would eventually finish at 10-1 and get an Orange Bowl matchup with Arkansas, but they couldn't get anything going, and Sims would record a first quarter fumble as Oklahoma lost 31-6, with Sims' sophomore season seeing him rush for 406 yards, averaging 6.2 yards per carry, and adding 6 touchdowns. So 1977 was supposed to be Sims' breakout year, but instead that would wait until 1978. Sims was the team's starting tailback as a junior, and he would definitely get opportunities, as the Sooners were known to be an all-run, no-pass team, as this season would see them average less than 10 pass attempts per game, yet more than 70 rush attempts, while rushing for over 470 yards per game, as along with Sims, they featured Kenny King and their quarterback Thomas Lott, who would rush for nearly 140 more yards than he passed for. But Sims was at the forefront of that rushing attack. He would go for over 100 yards on the ground in each of their first 2 games, versus Stanford and West Virginia. Then he would have his only sub-100-yard game of the year versus Rice, when he had 33 yards, but only played the first quarter of a blowout win. Then after a win versus Missouri, Sims would go for 131 yards and 2 touchdowns in a nationally televised win over number 6 Texas. And then after a win versus Kansas, Sims would go on a tear, as he would rush for at least 200 yards in each of his next 3 games, versus Iowa State, Kansas State, and Colorado, which were all wins, as the now 9-0 top-ranked Sooners were set to take on Nebraska. But Oklahoma couldn't take care of the ball if their life depended on it, as in the game they would fumble 9 times, losing 6 of them. Yet late in the game, they were still down by just 3, but then Sims would lose a fumble in Nebraska territory. Eventually the Sooners would get the ball back, but with about 3.5 minutes left, Sims would fumble again inside Nebraska's 5, as the Huskers would recover and run out the clock, ending Oklahoma's undefeated season. Then Oklahoma would blow out Oklahoma State in the following week to end their season at 10-1, but the loss to Nebraska had ended their national championship hopes. However, they would still get a chance for revenge, as they would play Nebraska again in the Orange Bowl. Oklahoma would get out to a 17-point lead going into the 4th and would survive a Nebraska comeback attempt, as the Sooners won 31-24, with Sims rushing for 134 yards and 2 touchdowns. As by season's end, he was the NCAA's leading rusher and had set an NCAA record for yards per carry, while also adding 20 touchdowns, as he was voted first-team All-Conference and named an All-American. And even though his fumbles versus Nebraska had cost him some votes, he would still win the Heisman as a junior, which was quite rare at this time, as his true comeback season had seen him rush for 1,762 yards on 7.6 yards per carry, with 20 touchdowns. Oklahoma had lost running back Kenny King and QB Thomas Lott to graduation, and while J.C. Watts filled Lott's position well, the Oklahoma ground attack did suffer, averaging about 85 less yards than last year. However, they were still putting up over 385 yards per game. Sims along with Charles White were Heisman favorites, and Sims would have another great season, as he would finish 3rd in the nation in rushing yards and 1st in rushing touchdowns, with a career high of 22. Oklahoma would start the season 4-0, but would then lose to Texas. They would run the table the rest of the year to finish at 10-1, but the loss to Texas had ruined their chances at a national championship. Additionally, by season's end, White had taken home the Heisman, with Sims finishing as runner-up. Sims had rushed for 529 yards in his final 2 regular season games, including a career-high 282 yards in a close win over Missouri on November 17th, and then a week later, he would run all over a Nebraska defense who hadn't allowed a 100-yard rusher all year, as he would finish with 247 yards. But at that point in the season, most of the Heisman ballots had already been cast, so Sims' incredible finish had gone largely unconsidered in his quest for a Heisman repeat. And although it wasn't the national championship, Oklahoma would win the Orange Bowl over undefeated Florida State, as Sims would go for over 100 yards while adding a 4th quarter touchdown, and he would once again be named first-team All-Conference, as well as voted an All-American, with his senior season seeing him rush for 1,506 yards on 6.7 yards per carry, while adding 22 touchdowns. So Sims had finished strong on what was once looking like a disappointing college career, and as he was widely considered the top pro prospect, he would declare for the 1980 NFL Draft, but he didn't come without his concerns. There were murmurs about his age, as he was set to turn 25 shortly into his potential rookie season, but there also seemed to be little concern around how many years he had left, even at that age. But another major concern was his pass catching, as with Oklahoma rarely throwing, Sims would only see 2 passes come his way during his 5 years there. However, he had hauled in both of them. And lastly, his fumbling issues that had come up during his time at Oklahoma. but Switzer would say these were more so due to him being a player who doesn't go down after first contact, and the potential was way too high to pass up, as the Detroit Lions would make Sims the first pick of the draft on April 29. Sims would dispel one of the concerns around him quite early, as on top of running a 4.4 40 and benching nearly 400 pounds at rookie camp, he reportedly caught everything they threw at him, as quarterback Gary Danielson would attribute this to all the pitches he received in Switzer's wishbone offense. But Danielson would also say that overall, Sims didn't look that special in the preseason, but by the time the regular season came and the games counted, Sims was clearly special. The Lions were coming off a 2-14 season and were one of the worst rushing attacks in the NFL, and overall they didn't have much on offense, but they would get a solid 1980 season from receiver Freddie Scott, and also had veteran fullback Dexter Bussey, who would have his final season with over 500 yards on the ground. So Sims was still a much-needed addition and would have a lot of pressure on him, but he would answer the call immediately. In his NFL debut versus the Rams, Sims would carry the ball 22 times for 153 yards and 3 touchdowns, while adding 2 catches for 64 more yards. Then the following week versus Green Bay, he would carry the ball 20 times for 134 yards and another touchdown on the ground, while showing that he was a very capable pass catcher, as he would be on the receiving end of an 87-yard touchdown, as this season would see him haul in a career-high 51 passes for a career-high 621 yards. And after 2 games, the Lions had matched their win total from last year, as overall Sims would record 3 more games with at least 100 yards, as he would remain healthy, playing and starting in all 16 games, and would even be a top 5 rusher in the league, while tying with Earl Campbell for the most rushing touchdowns this season. Detroit featured a much improved offense and a top 5 rushing attack, but also had an even better defense, as they had started the year 4-0, but would go 3-7 over their next 10. And even though they would win their final 2 games of the season, their 9-7 record would not be enough for a playoff berth. However, Sims' season would be enough for a Pro Bowl and a second-team All-Pro selection, as well as the Rookie of the Year award, as his overall season had seen him rush for 1,303 yards and 13 touchdowns, while catching 51 balls for 621 yards and 3 more touchdowns. But his 12 fumbles would also be top 5 in the league. 1981 would be the peak of Sims' career as a rusher. He would put up a career high in rushing yards while tying his career high of 13 rushing touchdowns, as he would finish top 3 in the league in both categories. And the Lions would have the league's top rushing offense, and overall a top 5 scoring offense. Sims would surpass the 100-yard mark in 7 games, which included 185 yards to go along with 2 touchdowns in a Week 6 loss to Denver. And his career-high rushing total would come in less than 2 games than last year, as he would miss 2 weeks in the middle of the season with turf toe. Freddie Scott would have the best season of his career, but overall the Lions had a below-average passing attack, so even though Sims was incredible, they needed more, as this year they would finish at 8-8 and miss the playoffs. But Sims was again voted a Pro Bowler and a second-team All-Pro, as he rushed for 1,437 yards and 13 touchdowns, while adding 28 catches for 451 yards and 2 more touchdowns. Unfortunately, Sims' 1982 season would be shortened, but it wasn't due to injury. The Lions really hadn't done much to improve their skill positions, so Sims would again be counted on to do the heavy lifting. And after putting up 33 yards and a touchdown against the tough Chicago Bears defense in a Week 1 win, he would rush for 119 yards while catching 5 passes for 103 more yards in a win over the Rams, as the Lions were now 2-0 with Sims coming off a great performance. But then just 2 days later, the 1982 lockout hit. The players' union went on strike as they wanted a wage scale based on percentage of gross revenues. But a lot of the players would grow to oppose the strike, as after just 57 days it was over. But the strike had resulted in the season being shortened to a total of 9 games. So the players were back, but the 2-0 Lions would lose 3 straight upon return. Then over their next 4, they would go 2-2 to finish at 4-5. And in the 7 games after the strike, Sims had struggled, but overall he would make his 3rd straight Pro Bowl appearance. And the Lions had done enough to make their first return to the playoffs since 1970. Detroit would take on Washington, but they would be embarrassed, as Sims never had a chance to get going. Sims did struggle on the ground, rushing for just 19 yards on 6 carries with 2 fumbles, but the Lions were also down by 24 at halftime, so they had to mostly abandon the run. However, Sims would still haul in 6 passes for 68 yards, as Detroit's season was over, with Sims' abbreviated year seeing him rush for 639 yards and 4 touchdowns, while adding 34 catches for 342 more yards. Prior to the season, Sims wanted a new contract, but according to his agent, Detroit didn't seem willing, so his agent would orchestrate a deal with the USFL's Houston Gamblers. But it was later revealed that Sims had signed with both the Lions and the Gamblers. Yet his agent had also misled him, as he owned a large percentage of the Gamblers and had actually not given the Lions a chance to match the contract, which would lead to this going to court, as ultimately the court would rescind the Houston contract and approve his 5-year extension with Detroit, and 1983 would be a memorable season of Detroit Lions football. The Lions had added rookie fullback James Jones, but overall they had a pretty average offense, and would have to rely on their second-ranked scoring defense to carry them this year. Sims would miss some time early in the season, but would still surpass the 1,000-yard mark, as he and Jones would combine for over 1,500 yards and 13 touchdowns. The Lions would win their first game, then lose their next 2, and after 3 games, Sims had only rushed for 95 yards. He would sit out the next 3 weeks as the Lions fell to 1-4 before defeating Green Bay in Week 6, as Sims was returning to a 2-4 team. But then over the rest of the season they were dangerous, going 8-3 to finish at 9-7 and would win a weak NFC Central division. And Sims had appeared in all 10 of those games, as he would put up nearly 1,300 total yards in that time and would have a 4-game stretch from Week 11 to Week 14 where he would surpass 100 yards on the ground each game, which would include his career high of 189 yards on 36 carries in a Week 12 win versus Green Bay. But more well known is a play that occurred during a Week 11 loss to Houston, where Sims would go airborne on a run and kick the Oilers' Steve Brown in the head, earning him the nickname of Kung Fu Billy Sims from Chris Berman. But the Lions were making a return to the playoffs, this time to take on a great 49ers team, and even though it shouldn't have been, it was a very close game. Going into the game, Gary Danielson was the Lions' starting QB, and by halftime the score was 14-9 in favor of the Niners. Yet the Lions hadn't been running much, so they would start giving Sims the ball more in the second half. But when they did throw, Lions fans were holding their breath every time, as overall for the game, Danielson would throw no touchdowns and 5 interceptions. But going into the fourth, the Lions were still down by just 8, and then Sims would get loose for an 11-yard score to bring them within 1. Then later he would run one in from 3 yards out as the Lions took the lead, but a late game Joe Montana-led drive would get the 49ers back out in front. And even though the Lions' Eddie Murray had a chance to kick a game-winning 44-yarder in the final seconds, he would miss, as the Lions would lose. Yet Sims would finish with 114 yards on the ground and his 2 touchdowns, as his overall season had seen him rush for 1,040 yards and 7 touchdowns, along with 42 catches for 419 more yards. Again, the Lions' offense didn't really feature any new weapons going into 1984, but they still had Sims, who was running great to start the year. But the Lions were not doing well, as after 6 games they were 1-5, and a little later in the season, they were in the third quarter of an eventual Week 8 win over Minnesota, which would improve their record to 3-5. With this game included, Sims was up to nearly 700 yards and 5 touchdowns on the year, and had hauled in over 30 passes, as he was on pace to set a career high in receptions. But then after a first down run for 11 yards, and then a Danielson 6-yard completion, Sims would sweep right for 2 yards, and was tackled by Lee Ashley, but Sims was injured on the play. Sims had suffered a knee injury, which he would blame on the turf, as his foot got caught and then he got tackled high, twisting his knee awkwardly, but it wasn't a direct hit on his knees. So although he knew something was off, he thought it was just a bad sprain, but then the pain started coming, as Sims said he had never felt anything like that in his life, and Eddie Murray would later call it a devastating thing to see, and Sims wasn't getting up, so you knew it was serious. But it was more so thought to be your typical ligament tear that comes with a severe knee injury, yet it would be way worse. Sims would undergo surgery, but it was more than just a single ligament tear, as the performing surgeon would list off everything that was damaged in his knee, so obviously this would have a long recovery time, especially in 1984. However, Sims was optimistic, as he expressed little doubt that he was going to make a full recovery and come back just as strong. But as the performing surgeon would say in a 2015 interview, it would have been hard to come back from that injury, even with all the modern day advancements that we have today. The Lions would end up finishing the season 4-11-1, and Sims would finish with 687 yards and 5 touchdowns, along with 31 catches for 239 yards. Sims would spend the next 2 years rehabbing his knee, but that 2-yard sweep in 1984 would ultimately be his final NFL play. Billy Sims could have been one of the absolute best had he played a full career. He rushed for around 4,000 yards and 50 touchdowns in college, while averaging an absurd 7.1 yards per carry. Then in the NFL, he was on a roster for 5 seasons, yet played all 16 games just once. and still finish his career with over 5,100 rushing yards. He had his ups and downs as an Oklahoma Sooner, but once he fully bought into Barry Switzer and believed the coaches wanted him, he put together one of the most dominant 2-year stretches in NCAA history, as a player that legitimately seemed like he could go for 200 yards whenever he wanted to. He left Oklahoma as a national champion and Heisman winner, and then became a first overall pick. Almost a decade before Barry Sanders, he was the first great Lions back to wear the number 20, and he wore it well, as a perennial Pro Bowler and great player on a bad team. The Lions could have been worse, but the main reason they were able to put points on the board during the early to mid-80s was Billy Sims. And Barry Sanders would have been great anywhere he went, but if Billy Sims stays healthy, the Lions would have had no need for Barry. But that's it for today's episode on Billy Sims. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on another NFC Central legend whose career was cut short due to injury. Or this one, on another overlooked running back. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.